I don't have any a PowerPoint or any means of display apart from what you see in front of you, but the text of what I'm going to say today is on my website, stephenconnor.com, easy to find if you'd like to, thereby rendering our presence here together entirely pointless in the way that we do nowadays. One of the most insistent, and as things currently stand, institutionally unappealing mottos of Michel Serres' writing is that, and he says this in various ways in various places, all the evil in the world comes from the libido of belonging, the libido d'appartenance. It would be easy to mistake this, and people have, for the assertion that the longing for belonging produces nothing but evil. This is, of course, not what Serres says, which is that whatever evil there may be will have arisen from the libido d'appartenance, the collusive lust for inclusion. Serres therefore doesn't rule out the possibility that some kinds of good might also arise from belonging, which is just as well, given that his own writing is so expressive at various times and responsive to the goods associated with loyalty and solidarity and membership in terms of class, region, and language, for example. Still, what Serres does say repeatedly seems disconcerting enough, and perhaps especially unpropitious for a group of persons hoping to find 36 hours worth of things to say about the relation of Serres' work to the idea of the social. In his Grand Récit tetralogy, so named, from 2001 onwards, Serres does his best to persuade his reader and himself that we are entering a phase of omniscience, employing the kind of verb known as the inceptive or inchoative, in which human communication will sublate the dichotomy between connection and disconnection. Electronic communications, he believes, will enable a kind of particulate ubiquitarity that will no longer require the cancelling out of individuality by generality. And here's Serres from Thumbelina. All the old belongings are dying, brotherhoods of weapons, parishes, motherlands, unions, and even families, which are being reorganized. Rather than these belongings whose names are abstract virtualities and whose bloody glory is praised by the history books, and rather than these false gods who consume infinite victims, I prefer our immanent virtue, which, like Europe, does not require anyone's death. We no longer want to coagulate our assemblies with blood. It was an audaciously sunny prospect, and one that doesn't currently look very close to being realized. One of the most prominent obstacles to it is the mode of socialized and socializing vehemence that I want to talk about for a few more minutes, that might be called the libido exaltationis, or lust for glory, which Serres links with assembly through that phrase I've just quoted, the coagulation of blood. Serres is understandably celebrated as a philosopher of communication, whose work is animated not only by the study of forms of transmission, passage, mediation, and communication, material and technological, but also, of course, by the ambition to establish lines of communication between different styles of thought relating to those. In a footnote to one of his earliest essays, he proposes that every form of communication for a homeothermal organism, that's to say one that needs to maintain its own temperature, every form of communication may amount to saying, keep me warm. But in fact, one of the structural features of Serres' work is its unresolved oscillation between the warring principles of contraction and detachment, coherence and dehiscence. Serres is almost obsessively convinced that the libido of belonging is never far removed from the making of war, while peace depends on distance and detachment, exemplified in the posture of detachment from tribe, party and allegiance, which he himself maintained with pertinacious politeness through his career. The thermodynamics of communication tend rather, and often in Serres' writing, to the conditions of autistic inferno. Here's Serres again. The collectivity knows only itself and gives itself only itself as object. Just checking to see, this is from Rome. Gives itself only itself as object, its noise, its relations, its streets and its swamp, its glory, its power, its hatreds, its politics. The collectivity is fed by and makes its clamors its delights, deaf to the noises of the world, blind to its light, insensible to its call. And in his book, Detachment, one of the least often cited, I think, of Serres' works, perhaps largely because of its title, Serres joins a long tradition of setting knowledge against worldly glory through the famous story of the meeting of Diogenes and Alexander the Great, which you'll remember. Alexander asks Diogenes what he can give him, and Diogenes says, "You can get out of my light." For Serres, glory is the joining of the secular and the eternal, a glory glue that I quoted in my title, that is constituted by the essentially religious ceremonies of the media. And this from Relire, Le Relier, the glory glue that is informative, symbolic, and virtual. In a word, negentropic. This immanent, gentle, vainglorious cohesiveness comes back on our screens from the virtual to a sort of reality by giving substance to the exchanged glances of society. La glue, la gloire colle le collectif, Serres crisply declares, an aphorism almost impossible to translate because of the absence in English of words meaning gluiness that begin with coll or the relative absence, but rather wanly translated as glory holds the members of a group together. One might perhaps have ventured something a little more adventurous, like glory glue is the collagen of the collective. Or the glue of glory is the protocol and escatacol of the collective, but they're perhaps a little themselves over showy. Glory produces war, the glory of war, and the war for glory, the glory war of all against all, the war for glory prosecuted in the glory of war, the spectacle that attests the glory and on which glory, in fact, depends. Why then glory glue? Surely the desire for glory is thumos, which, if untrammeled, must be physipparis, leading to an esteem war of all against all. How does the superlation of glory become collateral? Well, I think part of the answer is that the libido exaltationis, the lust for glory, is parceled out between the desire to be glorious oneself and the desire that, as the once popular phrase has it, glory be. And the desire for there to be glory is multiplied and intensified by the fiat gloria of collective glorification. We can surmise, and we better be able to, because I'm going to, we can surmise that every glorification of a particular object, whether it be deity, nation, saint, star, general, or guitar hero, is a magnificator, a let it be magnified, a magnification of magnificence itself through its often asymptomatic carriers. Among them, of course, angels. Angels are messages and messengers, but en masse in the mediation of their multitude, their role being to give unceasing glory to the Godhead. The hosts of singing angels that populated the theological imagination and are literalized in this part of the world in the teeming broods of carved angels perched on the hammer beams of East Anglian churches. When you go into an East Anglian church, look up, because they're only here. You don't see angel roofs, only very occasionally elsewhere in the UK. You will see non-Angli, said Angeli, the heavenly doubles of the hosts of the faithful, giving and making glory in their magnificence, literally the making great or artifice of greatness of their own glorification in and of numerosity. We worship what exceeds and has no need of our worship, but in the process, we make ourselves its necessity. The implication might be clear. Glory is the phenomenon of the host and the maximal most. We magnify it as we magnify ourselves by making ourselves part of the first person plural, the plurality made first personal of collectivity. The first and primal glory is in fact the infinity of the human, not of what infinitely exceeds it. For what infinitely exceeds the human is just the human itself, in its sense of its own gloriously uncompletable auto-essay. The glory of the human is its own capacity to glorify. And it's for this reason that glory is so wedded to the order of symbol, precisely because glory is the incommunicable, even as it depends upon the communication of this incommunicability, and is perhaps nothing less, nothing other than this communication. This makes glory the commons of the uncommon and the all too worldly figuring of the out of this world. The fetishes and false gods that Serres decries are indeed the signposts of absolute glory. Since glory must be beyond symbols, glory must also be activated in the very falling short of symbols, their idolatrous way of indicating that indication is all they can do. Those who lust after exaltation must also lust for and through its indicative symbols, which are able to lift up the lust for exaltation into the exaltation of lust. Glory exceeds, and in no wise more gloriously than in mass communications, as they go about the work of communicating their own gloriously inestimable massiveness and multitude. The greatest glory is in the saturating exorbitance of symbol. Serres wants us to think, however, in particular in his last book, Relire le Relier, that the absolute glory of the Godhead is designed to bring peace to the warring world through the very image it provides of the absolute unattainability of absolute glory in excelsis Deo. False gods eventually give access to the inaccessibly true God, he writes. False gods produce the collective relations that produce false gods, but in the end serve as filters of the truth. Absolute glory, according to Serres, serves to absorb and neutralize the war of all against all for relative and rivalrous glory. To avoid, so I'm quoting here from Relire, the translation of Relire le Relier, to avoid the prospect of total war and the possible extinction of the human race, glory must be given only to him than whom no one else is higher. Once the mortal poison of glory will have been borne away from us, carried off to infinitely inaccessible heights, we will live in peace. And this is very possibly the awing aim of the idea of transcendent glory. But there are other ways of looking at this. Responding to the arresting question he asks at the beginning of his book, The Kingdom and the Glory, Giorgio Agamben asks the question, the kingdom and the power we can understand, but why glory? For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory. Why glory? For Agamben, the superlative, in fact, must always engender comparatives or relative superlatives. Absolute height must always seem to let down rather than kick away the ladder of degree and gradation. So glory is the necessary accessory to the kingdom and the power. Here's Agamben. The function of acclamations and glory in the modern form of public opinion and consensus is still at the center of the political apparatuses of contemporary democracies. If the media are so important in those democracies, this is the case not only because they enable and control the government of public opinion, but also and above all because they manage and dispense glory, the acclamative and doxological aspect of power. Serres, of course, writes always of the need to hold back from or break with glory, trying to keep himself in the condition of what he calls the mystic miscreant, and holds out the promise that we might ourselves be able to avoid all membership. But he is fully aware too of the collegiality of power glory. I used to want to believe that the word college had something to do with reading together. Actually, it derives from collegare, meaning to stick together, from which the word religion also derives. Serres writes in The Troubadour of Knowledge, as it's translated, I passed enough of my life on warships and in lecture halls to testify before youth, which already knows that there is no difference between the purely animal or hierarchical customs of the playground, military tactics, and academic conduct. The same terror reigns in the covered playground in front of torpedo launchers and on campus. This fear that can pass for the fundamental passion of intellectual workers in the majestic shape of absolute knowledge. Knowledge and the soft realm of the sign have indeed multiplied the signs of glory and the glorification of signs in our world. I run here in Cambridge a research centre with the tumultuous name of CRASH, the Centre for Research in Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities. Although for something that I'm actually on the point of ceasing to do, I really need some such mood of the verb as the depletive or the anceptive. I tell people cheerfully that CRASH is well named because it engineers what Shaftesbury calls the amicable collisions, whereby he promises we civilly polish one another up. Of course, the acronym has a sonorous dimension too, in a way that may connect with Serres' reflections on the philosophy of noise. For the acronym TRASH is also, of course, a caconym. And noise is inseparable from glory, and the shivering imperium of tumult is the caconomy and the cacocracy to which communication will always, at its limit, tend. Many cultures, as we know, make a noise as part of their ceremonies of acclamation, as enjoined by Psalm 100, in fact, a number of other psalms too. Make a joyful noise unto the Lord. Noise here translates Hebrew ruah, used many times in the Bible to signify a war cry, alarm, roar of triumph, or sometimes howl of distress. Spenser, in his Faerie Queen in 1590, could still evoke a heavenly noise, like as it had been many an angel's voice singing before the eternal majesty. And noise could also name a company of musicians or noisemakers, as well as, up until the end of the 16th century, fame or reputation generally. But of course, in English, after that time, after about the 16th century, the idea of noise seems steadily to have absconded from the realms of glory and to become ever more noisome and nauseous, even as the phenomenon named by the word has increased in amplitude and volume. The noise of communications and the urge to blare abroad the noise of one's own communication has become an ever more encompassing principle. In UK higher education, for example, communication being known in military terms as the principle of what is known martially as impact, often micro-measured in what are called hits. An academic research center in a large university, and even a small university, is equipped to provide a wormhole into the global chorality of publicity. An academic research center is no still small voice, but is the peri-epicenter of the shuddering earthquake that binds the socialized earth together. An earthquake destroys. The reports of earthquake, recent or impending, are cohesion itself. The solemn, sinister history of the word doxa hums the understory of the affinity between thinking and glory that Freud would wisely name Allmächtigkeit, omnipotence. The word doxa, deriving from Greek dokeo, I think, imagine, consider, suppose, presume, is translated throughout the Bible with the word glory, as in the doxology, glory be to the Father and to the Son and to the Holy Ghost. The idea being that the glory of God is such as to demand its reflection back on itself via the angelic surrogation of human glorification, or more soberly, opinion. The doxology is therefore the glorifying utterance of glory in formulae like Gloria in excelsis Deo. Glory and opinion remain impossible to dissever. So, as I've mentioned, Serres' later belief is that absolute glory will cancel out the pitiable tootlings of worldly glory, and the glory of divinity diminish to nothing the libido of ersatz, earthly exaltations. Serres' self-wrought intoxication may, I think, point us to a soberer apprehension that as communication approaches its maximum, and communication will always, it seems, tend towards its own maximum, what must hold humans together, the fractious community brewed from the buzz of their communications, is the esteem war of all against all. In the 18th century, many believed that the search for the good opinion of others, the economy of what Bernard Mandeville called the aerial coin of praise, was, in the absence of any indwelling instincts of sorority, the sovereign form of social cement. But such arguments must disturbingly accept the indissoluble community between what Mandeville calls the noisy toils of war and public bustle of the ambitious. Serres himself is unable to reconcile his own fluctuation between the rapt belief that, as he writes, culture escapes glory and that culture continues war by other means. Those two quotations signaling this oscillation. The oscillation is there not because glory and war are irreconcilable, but actually because they are everywhere glued together, cohering, cohabiting, colleged, we might even say, in the very forms of human collectivity through the exaltation of repute, report, and the rancorous rumor of acclaim. The difference is not one of quality, but of scale, quantity, mass, and multitude. It is certainly true that communication is a good thing. It is equally certainly not true, as Aristotle, Confucius, and everybody's mother knew, that the more of a good thing you have, the better.
An association. I don't know whether you can do anything with it. So this paradox of belonging and also of peace and glory in that sense. For me, the case of Serres always makes me think of and it's quite explicit on that many levels on Girard's logic, right, of scapegoat mechanism that produce violence, that then produce some peace, that then produce again violence, that kind of logic that you find in Serres very enough. So in that sense, if indeed we want to focus on the kind of politics that come out of Serres, I think one of the questions I would also pose is it just Girard behind it? Does he surpass it? Because you can criticize Girard in that sense, if indeed all the desires for belonging, etc., are mimetic. Is it then inevitably limited to this kind of violence, etc., and only a kind of game of temporarily pacifying things with the endlessly these new options of violence popping up again when that object, that fetish, becomes absolute in another sense.
Yeah, and this gets kind of literalized in La Guerre Mondiale, which is a book in which he comes closest to saying, okay, forgive me putting it this way, you know, we owe the peace of the last 70 years or so to NATO. He doesn't say that, of course, and he's not likely to say that right now, but to deterrence. So we owe peace to terror. And this may accidentally be true, but only accidentally. You know, perhaps it looks nowadays as though we got away with peace, and the peace has now, you know, got away from us, or may. I actually think that Serres' thinking is poetically potent, but politically not very subtle on this matter. But perhaps, yeah. I think when it comes to this kind of question of at what scale is it possible for us to live peacefully, Serres suggests questions that he doesn't really that he doesn't work through. But it is a very simple principle. I should have spent longer on it. That there are lots and lots and lots of things that are definitely good if you've got a bit of them, and are definitely horrible if you. Yeah, almost everything actually. Almost every good is of this kind. Maybe it's just because it's not a very kind of novel or philosophically interesting thing to say because your mum knew it.
Yeah, so the example of the atomic bomb, I think Jean-Pierre Guthrie also focused on that again, drawing on Serres and Girard, and he mentioned this anecdote also. I think it was it Clinton or Bush, when they were setting up new missiles defense systems, they were assuring the Russians, like, yeah, your missiles will get through, otherwise the deterrence isn't working.
Yes, yeah, yes, exactly.
Kind of very, strange deterrence policy there.
It is,
should be able to destroy it. Therefore,
absolutely, and the aggressiveness of allegedly of Reagan's so-called Star Wars policy, because you know, if we can't actually blow you up, that's really dangerous. And there is a sort of perverse logic in that. Yes, I mean, I honestly myself don't know what to do with this.
Thank you so much. I was just wondering if we could tease out the implications of the Christian narrative of glorification a little bit more on some of its vertical axis. So if the Hebrew word kavod has this sense of heaviness, weight, density, and that the reaction of Old Testament people to a vision of the glory of God is always to be pushed down, whether Isaiah or Job, or indeed the disciples when they get to their knees at the Transfiguration. And if the Christian motif of salvation is somehow that Jesus was crushed or pushed down so that we could be lifted up. So we have here in the Christian narrative of glorification a lifting up. So perhaps we're close to your initial diagnosis, but there is the claim, isn't there, that this is a different glorification, that it's a glorification to humility and into a collectivity without rancor and so on. And I think this is what Girard would offer as his doctrine of imitatio Christi, that it's a positive mimesis of one who will bring us into a collective without violence somehow. So is this a third way even? Or is that just also myth in some form?
Yeah. I mean, I think the closest, I think from my reading of Serres, that Serres comes to this, to the practicality of this, is the notion that if you have a kind of communication that isn't really communication, where I can't kind of reach you, then that's to say, kind of dispersed communication. Then you can, in a certain sense, you know, we can be the deterrents of conflict for each other. But I just don't really believe that. And it doesn't look much like that. It doesn't look as though, you know, social media tends towards that. It looks as though social media tends towards exactly the kind, as a matter of fact, potentiates the kinds of coagulations that I began by quoting. I'm interested in the bearing down, actually, of that. There's a very good Jewish joke about this, that so in the religious ceremony, the rabbi calls out in ecstasy, "O exalted one, I am as nothing in thy presence." And then next to him, the cantor says, "O supreme one, I am mere darkness and dust before you." And then a little voice comes from the back of the congregation saying, "Oh, I am a worm in thy sight, O Lord." And the rabbi turns to the cantor and says, "Who is he to be a worm in the sight of the Lord?" Because there is exaltation in lowering. Because you are in two places when you have represented yourself as borne down upon, and there is a certain kind of omnipotence fantasy in the fantasy of being, you know, infinitely small or of no account at all. And I think that's precisely why it's cathexis in Freud's term, which he hardly ever used actually, but was foisted on him by his English translation. That's, you know, that's why it's so exciting to be thought to be powerless. And that's why it's so powerful to be thought to be powerless. And that's why powerlessness is such a weapon nowadays in our communication wars, because these two sides are, you know, they are radically ambivalent, and there's a kind of vehemence that goes with it. Those two thoughts are prompted by what you said, but not very lucidly connected. You know.
Shall we come back to you, or shall we go?
Go ahead, go, let's carry on. Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. It was very nice to hear also how you crafted the paper. It's very well, yeah, beautifully written and presented. The question I would like to maybe first just ask is how you would think about the relation of what you presented about communication and this kind of escalation dynamics that is proper to it with respect to the social, for sure, to the natural contract, that it becomes very important that communication is actually natural. So not the split between communication as a social affair and nature, which would be the object or the good of communication or the reference is dissolved. So that's one thing. So to make communication an elemental thing, which I think link to this challenge we have for a cyclical way of thinking, you know, with recycling, with climate, with ecology, with all these things. So a communication which does not go in a directional sense, but which goes in a sense of cyclicity and if you want, so tempering, more like the weather. And then there is this other aspect in the natural contract, which is disturbing in many ways, because it has this link of the contract, which actually would make the distinction between a natural wielding of forces into a kind of a nature as a kind of war situation, because war is not pure force or violence insofar as there is a law with respect to it, as we
Yeah.
are all challenged now by terrorism and new forms of violence.
Yeah.
So how would you make a connection now between the drastic escalation scenario
Mhm.
that you were drawing, the kind of loss of hope that Serres politics is any good because it's naive, to this kind of strand in Serres' work, which really tries to make a bridge in a fundamental level that cannot be accommodated in the social escalation scheme.
Yeah, yeah. This is another oscillation, really. I mean, in a certain kind of sense, Serres is not really a philosopher. He's a sort of phenomenologist of the philosophical. He sort of watches what goes on. At the same time, he does offer things like the idea of the natural contract as a kind of, legal fiction, he uses the phrase, that would be a very good thing to have. And I can't decide whether the natural contract is just a kind of handy way of talking ourselves into, an idea. I mean, nature is drawn into a contract, but nature doesn't care whether or not it's drawn into a contract or not. It will do us probably, almost certainly, a lot of good to act as though nature were the kind of thing that could be the party to a contract. So there's something autistic about that, that very process. But maybe it's useful. I'm on top of everything else a utilitarian, which means that I think that things are only worthwhile if they turn out to be worthwhile on the various scales of things being worthwhile that are abroad in the world, or that may come to be. And that may sound rather floppy and unphilosophical than most people think it is. I think Serres has much more of a project. I think he wants us, as it were, to decide the way to think and think it. And I think that's hopeless. And always has been hopeless. It's what politics is about. But certainly as a way of not doing bad things anymore. The best way not to do bad things anymore is to do other things. And the least good way of stopping doing bad things is to keep reminding yourself how bad they are. That's why anti-racism is the worst kind of racism, because it just embeds the poison in your mind. If you could persuade people to think about other much more interesting things than racism, for example, you'd stand a much better chance of moving away from it, as opposed to zero chance, which is what we currently have. So I think that kind of project of let's provide, as it were, a kind of little model of the way of thinking that we have, and remember to stick to it, is actually hopeless. Luckily, though, we're not very good at doing things like that. So maybe the getting interested in other things thing will happen in any case.
Just briefly, because the getting interested in other things is the way that natural contract works. So it's the reminder of having a mutual interest in common, which is more fundamental than the resolution of the social conflict.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, Stephen. That was a great paper, and you've shown me a corner, and I'm sure there are many corners I've still to visit, but you've shown me a corner of Serres that I was unaware of. Now, I wonder what your response might be here. I think one of the great, constantly refreshing things about Serres, but one of the most annoying at the same time, is how flat-footedly reactionary he can be, in the same breath, more or less, as he's constructing quite radical models of behavior and understanding. And at several points throughout the paper, I was thinking to myself, if we took this to be not a description of a kind of ubiquitized particularity, which I thought was a great phrase, which is the modern age of communication for Serres. But a description of the British Empire, the history of the British Empire. We can see a similar kind of dynamic go on, whereby the citizens of the British Empire, lowly and forelock-tugging as they may have been, were nevertheless thickened by the thought of the glory of the empire itself. And there are a few phrases which you conveyed to us from Serres. We worship what exceeds us and has no need of our worship, but in doing so make ourselves necessary to it. Symbols are the conduit of glory. To avoid war, glory must be given only to him when there's no, than whom there's nothing higher. So Leviathan, empire, this is a description of that at the same time as it is particularized or particulate ubiquity. And I wonder, do you see it as our job to extricate that kind of reactionary moment from Serres, or do we just take him warts and all? What's your feeling on it? If you agree with what I said.
That's interesting. I like the empire idea. Well, and as regards to the question of, do we, perhaps the question is there some kind of way of redeeming the work of Serres and
trying to avoid quite putting it like
something like that. I mean, I on the whole don't go in for redemption and sort of go in for warts and all, because there are warts. So that's the sense in which I think I'm not inclined to think, and forgive me for saying this if forgiveness is necessary or requisite, that Serres is the kind of thinker who is likely to deliver a kind of program. Luckily, because thinkers who deliver programs last no time at all, because the programs turn out to be programmatic. I don't know what to do with this, but it is really precisely because in a certain sense, this is what I find refreshing about Serres, that there is a kind of drama or spectacle of thinking through this, rather than something that is really pretending to be a process a process of calculation. I think I see this as the certain kind of performance of various sorts of predicament in Serres. So I don't think, and luckily for him, and perhaps luckily for us, I don't really think Serres is a political thinker. It's that he's a thinker about politics, but I don't think he's ultimately a political thinker.
Is there time for one more?
Yeah.
And you'll have to forgive me, some of this might be my ignorance, but certainly finding come both lately to these discussions. But my areas of research have to do with applied evidence. And from my readings here, which is elementary, I have a sort of more optimistic way of thinking about it as a political and ethical thinker, and that the vice that you're picking out is in fact the virtue of this thought. Because I think Serres recognizes that the kinds of problems that confront us will never allow for a sort of straightforward, put your flag in the sand answer. So in my research, I've come across a couple of thinkers in systems design and urban planning named Riddle and Weber, who published a paper called 3 Dilemmas in Urban Planning, where they outlined what they call wicked problems. Right? And there's some 10 or 11 categories what constitutes a wicked problem, but one of them is their insolubility, that you really can't frame a straightforward answer to a political question. So it looks in some ways like being maybe somewhat non-committal, or sort of, as you put it, just sort of talking about political stuff as opposed to engaging with it in a thoughtful way. Riddle and Weber's paper shows that there is no sort of definitive way to approach a political question. And so Serres' thinking mirrors the fact of the problems that we face, right? And so he's teaching us how to think about political problems, not merely just commenting on them, would be my way of reading it.
Yeah.
So just something to offer.
That I feel that resonates with what I was trying not very well to articulate. Yeah, about the kind of phenomenology of the problem, what it's like to be in that predicament rather than here's the way out.
Yeah, but I think in that, if you take that one step further, maybe there is a way to chart a course through some of these problems, knowing that there's never an absolute answer. So stay tuned when I finish my thesis.
Yes. Yes.
Bernadette has her hand up on Zoom.
Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you for, can you hear me?
Yes.
We can.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. Just wanted to reflect about, could it be possible to make a parallel between what Serres wrote about glorification or glory as the glue of war, in a sense, and what he wrote about criticism. You know, criticism is also a way to create, both are creating hierarchy, either by magnifying someone else or by disqualifying someone else. So maybe it's through this ontological imbalance, you know, that there is the creation of a war, something that really feeds war. And maybe we could read all these papers through an ontological prism lens.
Yes. I mean, I think it's certainly true that the notion of criticism, critique, all those cutting words, Quinean, you know, to cut. I think the kind of implicit aggressiveness of that is there throughout Serres. I mean, I guess the problem to which I keep coming back is, well, is it really true that there are modes of the negative, there are modes of hostility that are just not as bad as like actually punching people? I mean, it is true that there are symbolic means of belittling people that feel almost as bad as being punched in the face, but hardly anything is as bad as really being punched in the face. I promise you, it's really true. So, you know, that I think is the question. Are there modes of somehow keeping at bay ultimate kinds of terror through the modes, through the kind of minimal modes? This would be a sort of logic of political inoculation, perhaps, or, you know, Peter Sloterdijk would call it immunological. Perhaps Serres is indeed that kind of thinker. I'm really, come back to me on what you mean when you say that this is ontological, though. I'm not quite grasping.
Yeah, it's just a suggestion. We have to think about it. Because I think what is important in it is the idea of really having the people on the same level. You know, there is a kind of, in my view at least, in Serres, there is a kind of fascination for horizontality versus verticality. And that was my suggestion, you know, it's the refusal of creating this kind of verticalities through any kinds of means, and meaning which really cannot maintain the balance of power.
Yeah, yeah.
But definitely what you said also made me, Serres has no, as you say, he's not a political thinker. You're right. In my view, he's not even democratic. I don't know, but the idea, there is no democratic ideal in my from what I know from him. I don't know.
I was wondering whether there's an important distinction.
We'll have to be the last.
It's just, is there a distinction there between democratic and republican? That he's a republican thinker and not a democratic thinker?
Bernadette, would you like to reply?
I'm not sure about Republican. In France, everything is about Republican.
Yes.
And the two terms tend to be identified, though it's obviously not the case. Is Serres more Republican? I don't know. You know, I'm just raising the issue. I have no answer.
We're going to have to draw stumps on this particular discussion then. I'm sure we can pick up these things later. Steve, thank you so much. Okay, thank you.